My name is Victoria Hale. I am 56 years old, and until 3 years ago, I believed I understood how power worked inside a room. I live in Savannah, Georgia, in a historic district where the houses are painted in gentle pastels and the neighbors smile as if courtesy alone can keep darkness from crossing a threshold. For most of my adult life, I was a litigation strategist, the woman corporations hired when their leadership was under investigation, when lawsuits threatened to drag private failures into public courtrooms. I built my reputation on composure. I did not react. I calculated. I never raised my voice when others were shouting. I watched patterns, collected details, and waited for the precise moment when evidence outweighed denial. I thought those skills belonged only to boardrooms and legal filings. I was wrong. The night I saw my daughter's fiancé grip her arm hard enough to make her swallow a cry, while his sister laughed and refilled her wine glass, I understood with terrifying clarity that I would need every skill I had ever sharpened, not for a client, but for my child. My daughter, Amelia, was 32 that autumn. She was an architect, the kind who believed buildings could change the way people felt about themselves. As a girl, she used to build cities out of cardboard boxes in our living room, insisting that parks should be placed where lonely people might wander into company. She had her father's stubborn optimism. When Daniel entered her life, he seemed to admire that about her. He was charismatic, well-dressed, and came from a family that owned several luxury hotels along the East Coast. His sister, Caroline, managed public relations for their brand and liked to remind people that reputation was everything. The engagement moved quickly. Daniel spoke about destiny, about knowing immediately that Amelia was different from other women. He praised her ambition, said he wanted a partner, not a shadow. I remember feeling cautious, but unwilling to interfere. After my husband died 5 years earlier, I promised myself I would not smother Amelia with fear disguised as wisdom. She deserved joy. I convinced myself that my unease was simply the reflex of a protective mother who had spent too long anticipating worst-case scenarios. The first shift was so subtle, I almost missed it. Amelia stopped challenging Daniel in conversation. She had always loved debate, it energized her. Yet suddenly she deferred. If he misquoted something, she stayed silent. If he dismissed one of her design ideas as impractical, she smiled as if the criticism were helpful. When I asked her privately whether everything felt balanced, she brushed off my concern. He just has strong opinions, she told me. It's part of what makes him successful. Strong opinions. I had heard that phrase before in conference rooms where subordinates were expected to absorb humiliation in exchange for proximity to power. Still, there were no bruises, no raised voices, no dramatic scenes. There were only small adjustments. Amelia began dressing differently, softer colors, higher necklines, fewer of the bold geometric earrings she loved. She explained that Daniel preferred a timeless look, especially when attending industry events. It sounded reasonable. That was the genius of it. Every concession arrived wrapped in logic. She worked slightly fewer hours. She declined a speaking engagement because Daniel thought public visibility might create unnecessary competition in their relationship. I watched her world shrink by inches, and because each inch looked voluntary, I told myself I was imagining danger. The evening everything crystallized was meant to be celebratory. Daniel's family had invited us to their winter estate outside Charleston to announce a new hotel acquisition. The house was enormous, all glass and stone, designed to impress without seeming to try. Caroline floated through the rooms, directing staff with subtle hand gestures, her smile polished and thin. Amelia wore a long-sleeved navy dress despite the mild weather. When she hugged me, I felt tension in her shoulders, but she whispered that she was simply tired from deadlines. During dinner, conversation revolved around expansion plans, investors' legacy. Daniel spoke confidently about the future, about how Amelia's architectural expertise would elevate their brand. He described her talent as if it were an asset he had acquired. I saw her flinch, almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. Later, when she corrected a minor detail about a sustainability feature, gently, professionally, Daniel's expression shifted. Not rage, not embarrassment, calculation. He reached across the table under the pretense of affection and squeezed her arm. Hard. Her posture stiffened. Caroline noticed and smiled into her glass. Daniel hates being contradicted in public, she said lightly. But Amelia's still learning. The table laughed softly, as though this were an inside joke. I did not laugh. I memorized the moment instead. The angle of his hand, the color draining from my daughter's face, the approval in his sister's eyes. I did not confront him that night. That restraint cost me more than anger would have. But I recognized something essential. This was not spontaneous cruelty. It was choreography. Daniel was testing how far he could go with witnesses present. Caroline's comment was not casual. It was reinforcement. When Amelia and I found ourselves alone in the hallway later, I asked her directly if he had hurt her. She hesitated, just long enough to confirm what I feared, and then shook her head. It's nothing, she insisted. He just gets tense when he feels undermined. Undermined. As if her confidence were sabotage. I wanted to shake her, to demand she see what was unfolding. Instead, I held her hands and said, "You never need to make yourself smaller to keep someone steady." She looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mix of gratitude and terror. Terror not of him in that moment, but of what would happen if she believed me. That was when I understood that this was no longer about occasional control. It was about conditioning. He was teaching her that harmony required obedience, and Caroline was normalizing the lesson. Over the next weeks, the pattern intensified. Amelia's colleagues began treating her differently. One of her projects was reassigned after Daniel privately questioned whether wedding planning might distract her from deadlines. Invitations she once received independently now came addressed to both of them, with Daniel answering on her behalf. When she attempted to reassert herself, he reframed her resistance as emotional instability. "You've been so sensitive lately," he would murmur in front of others. "I'm worried about you." It was brilliant in its cruelty. Concern is far more persuasive than accusation. Caroline amplified the narrative, suggesting Amelia might benefit from focusing on family instead of ego-driven ambition. I recognized the strategy immediately. Isolate, redefine, erode. I had seen corporations dismantle whistleblowers this way, not by attacking them outright, but by gently recasting them as unreliable. Amelia began apologizing for things that required no apology. She asked Daniel's opinion before making minor decisions. She started to question her memory of events. "Maybe I did overreact," she said to me once, her voice small. That sentence chilled me more than any visible injury could have. The turning point came unexpectedly on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Amelia arrived at my house unannounced, something she had not done in months. She was pale, her eyes rimmed red, but her posture was rigid with determination. She rolled up her sleeve, without speaking. Faint bruises marked the inside of her arm, fingerprints already fading from purple to yellow. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "What happened?" I asked. She told me about an argument over a design proposal she refused to abandon. Daniel had accused her of disrespect. When she tried to leave the room, he blocked the doorway and grabbed her. Not violently enough to leave obvious damage. Just enough to remind her who controlled the exit. Caroline, she said, had later advised her to avoid provoking him during high-stress phases. I felt something inside me settle into cold focus. This was no longer ambiguity. This was escalation. I embraced my daughter, and for the first time since her engagement, she allowed herself to sob without restraint. As I held her, I understood that reacting with fury would only confirm the narrative they were building, that I was dramatic, intrusive, destabilizing. So I chose the only path I knew how to walk. I would observe. I would document. And when the moment came, I would dismantle everything they believed untouchable. When Amelia finally admitted that she was afraid, she did not say the word directly. She said she felt off balance, as if the ground beneath her kept shifting without warning. I understood that language. Victims of controlled environments rarely identify fear at first. They describe instability, confusion, exhaustion. I told her we would move carefully, that nothing would happen without her consent. That distinction mattered. Daniel had built his influence by overriding her instincts. I refused to do the same, even in the name of protection. We began with small steps. She forwarded me emails, dozens of them, messages that looked harmless in isolation. Daniel advising her not to attend networking dinners alone because it sent the wrong signal. Daniel suggesting she postpone applying for a senior partnership role because the timing might complicate family optics. Daniel apologizing after arguments, but attaching subtle blame. If you hadn't pushed so hard, I wouldn't have reacted. The pattern was unmistakable. Every apology contained a hook. Every conflict ended with her assuming responsibility for his behavior. I created a secure archive and dated everything. I instructed Amelia to keep a private journal, factual and unemotional. No adjectives, just events.
Time.
Location. Witnesses. Exact words spoken. Abuse thrives in ambiguity. Documentation removes its camouflage. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior shifted almost imperceptibly, as though he sensed resistance forming beneath the surface. He became attentive again, sending flowers to Amelia's office, praising her work publicly, tagging her in social media posts that described her as his brilliant future wife. The performance was strategic. If she spoke out now, people would see romance, not coercion. Caroline intensified her involvement as well. She invited Amelia to charity luncheons and introduced her as Daniel's calming influence, a phrase that sounded complimentary until one considered its implication, that he required management and she existed to provide it. I attended one of those luncheons at Amelia's request. Caroline's smile never faltered, but her eyes assessed me constantly, calculating what I knew. She steered conversations toward legacy and loyalty. "Strong families protect their own," she said at one point, her tone casual. It was not a statement, it was a warning. I responded with equal composure. "Strong families also hold their own accountable," I replied. Her expression flickered for half a second before smoothing again. That flicker told me we were no longer invisible. A week later, the pressure escalated. Amelia's firm informed her that an anonymous complaint had questioned her professionalism, citing erratic interpersonal behavior and difficulty collaborating under stress. The language was clinical, carefully constructed. Daniel denied involvement, of course, expressing outrage that anyone would undermine her career. But the timing was too precise. The complaint arrived 2 days after Amelia declined to attend a hotel acquisition event where she was expected to appear as supportive fiancé rather than independent architect. Caroline called that evening, her voice soft with manufactured concern. She suggested that perhaps wedding planning and career ambition were overwhelming Amelia. "Sometimes stepping back is an act of wisdom," she murmured. I watched my daughter absorb the implication that her competence was deteriorating. That night Amelia asked me, in a voice that barely held together, whether it would be easier to just compromise. I asked her one question in return. "Compromise what?" She opened her mouth and found no answer, because what Daniel demanded was not compromise. It was surrender. The first overt threat came disguised as vulnerability. Daniel arrived at my home unannounced one afternoon while Amelia was at work. He asked to speak privately. I agreed, not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to hear how he framed the narrative when she was absent. He positioned himself in my living room like a penitent son. He spoke about pressure, about expectations, about how much he loved Amelia and feared losing her. He admitted to moments of intensity, but insisted they were provoked by misunderstanding. Then he shifted subtly. He mentioned the investments his family had made in Amelia's upcoming design projects. He referenced the influence Caroline's firm held in certain development boards. It would be unfortunate, he said carefully, if personal confusion damaged professional momentum. There it was. Not a threat. A forecast. I met his gaze without blinking. It would be unfortunate, I replied evenly, if attempts to intimidate my daughter were documented and interpreted as coercion. The silence that followed stretched thin. He smiled eventually, but it no longer reached his eyes. When he left, I locked the door and immediately wrote down every word of our conversation. 2 nights later, Amelia called me in a whisper. Daniel had accessed her laptop while she showered and confronted her about the journal she had been keeping. He did not shout. He sat on the edge of the bed and explained how secrecy damaged trust. He asked whether she was planning to build a case against him. The phrasing was deliberate. He knew exactly what documentation meant. When she refused to delete the files, he punched the wall beside her head, not touching her, but close enough that plaster dust fell onto her shoulder. He apologized within minutes, blaming stress again, blaming my influence. He said I was poisoning her against him. Caroline arrived the next morning with breakfast and a lecture about external interference destroying marriages. Amelia listened in silence. But when she recounted the scene to me later, something had changed. Her voice no longer trembled. It carried anger beneath the fear. He doesn't get to rewrite reality anymore, she said quietly. That was the first sign that the conditioning was cracking. I knew we needed leverage beyond personal testimony. Patterns convince investigators. Emotion does not. I reached out discreetly to a former colleague who specialized in forensic accounting. Without revealing names, I asked him to examine publicly available records related to Daniel's hotel expansions. Within days, he called back with cautious concern. Several properties had been transferred between shell companies before acquisitions, obscuring liability trails. Nothing illegal on the surface, but complex enough to invite scrutiny. I did not act immediately. Information is most powerful when revealed at the precise moment of denial. Meanwhile, Amelia agreed to record conversations when she felt safe doing so. Not to entrap, but to preserve context. The first recording captured Daniel instructing her to withdraw from a design competition because winning would create imbalance. His tone was calm, almost affectionate, as he described how her visibility threatened the narrative of unified leadership he was cultivating. Listening to it later, I felt a surge of controlled fury. He did not love her brilliance. He resented any light not reflecting off him. The breaking point arrived sooner than I expected. At a private engagement dinner hosted by Daniel's family, Amelia announced that she would be postponing the wedding indefinitely. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She simply stated that she required space to reassess the relationship. The room froze. Caroline recovered first, laughing as if it were a joke. Daniel's face hardened into something unrecognizable. He excused them both from the table and followed Amelia into the garden. I remained seated for exactly 10 seconds before standing and walking after them. I heard his voice before I saw them, low, urgent, dangerous. He accused her of humiliating him. He said she was ungrateful, unstable, manipulated by a paranoid mother. When she attempted to walk away, he grabbed her wrist. This time there were witnesses. I stepped forward and said his name once, clearly. He released her immediately, aware of the audience gathering at the windows. Caroline appeared seconds later, already shaping the narrative. "Emotions are high," she announced to no one in particular. "Let's not misinterpret passion." I met her gaze and replied, "Passion does not require restraint by force." The guests heard that. The word force hung in the air like a fracture line. That night Amelia packed a single suitcase and came home with me. Daniel called repeatedly, alternating between apology and accusation. Caroline sent messages warning of reputational fallout, of contracts at risk, of legal complications if Amelia pursued defamation. I documented everything. By morning, I had contacted an attorney specializing in domestic coercion cases. We filed for a protective order based on documented incidents and recorded evidence. Daniel responded with predictable outrage, claiming fabrication, claiming emotional abuse on her part. But this time we were prepared. We had timestamps, audio, witnesses from the garden. And we had something more powerful than fear: clarity. Amelia did not waver when she signed the paperwork. Her hand shook only once, then steadied. "I thought leaving would feel like losing," she said softly as we walked out of the courthouse. "It feels like oxygen." I squeezed her hand and allowed myself, for the first time, to believe that the system Daniel relied upon was not invincible. It was simply accustomed to silence. And silence, once broken, does not easily return. The moment the protective order was served, the performance ended. Daniel did not call to apologize again. He did not send flowers. He shifted strategies with a precision that almost impressed me. Within 48 hours, Amelia's firm received a formal notice from an attorney representing Daniel's family interests, alleging breach of confidentiality regarding proprietary hotel designs. The claim was vague but intimidating enough to create panic in a corporate environment that valued stability above truth. Amelia was placed on temporary leave pending internal review. The language was neutral, the implication was not. Caroline began circulating quiet suggestions through social channels that Amelia had been emotionally unstable for months. She never accused directly. She asked questions instead. Had anyone else noticed Amelia seemed overwhelmed? Was it wise to entrust large-scale projects to someone navigating personal turmoil? It was strategic character erosion, the same technique Daniel had used privately, now executed publicly. They were not trying to prove her wrong. They were trying to make her unreliable. I recognized the maneuver instantly. When facts threaten power, power attacks perception. Amelia felt the shift immediately. She stopped opening her laptop, afraid of what new accusation might appear. She questioned whether filing the protective order had been a mistake. "Maybe I escalated it," she said one night, staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom. "Maybe I should have handled it quietly." That doubt was the residue of conditioning. I sat beside her and spoke evenly. "Abuse depends on quiet," I reminded her. "Accountability does not." But reassurance alone would not be enough. Daniel's family had resources, influence, and a reputation carefully curated over decades. They believed endurance would exhaust us. They assumed I would panic once professional pressure mounted. They underestimated how familiar I was with drawn-out wars of attrition. I contacted the attorney handling Amelia's order and expanded our strategy. We would not merely defend, we would investigate. If Daniel wanted legal confrontation, we would welcome it under full light. The recordings Amelia had captured became critical. One in particular shifted the balance. In it, Daniel spoke candidly about leveraging his family's connections to manage narratives if Amelia ever acted irrationally. He described reputational containment as though it were standard procedure. His tone was calm, almost instructional. When our attorney listened, she went silent for several seconds. "This is coercive control," she said finally. "And it's provable." That word mattered. proving a pattern transforms a private grievance into a legal structure. We compiled a timeline: the subtle discouragement of Amelia's promotions, the anonymous complaint to her firm, the threats disguised as concern, the physical restraint witnessed at the engagement dinner. Each incident alone could be dismissed. Together they formed architecture. Daniel had not been losing control. He had been exercising it systematically. Caroline responded with escalation. A story appeared in a regional business blog questioning Amelia's professional integrity. It cited unnamed sources and referenced the pending legal dispute without context. The implication was clear: a talented architect undone by emotional instability. The article spread quickly in industry circles. Amelia read it once, and then closed her eyes as if struck. "They're rewriting me," she whispered. I felt anger rise, sharp and immediate, but I forced it into focus. "Then we correct the record," I said. Instead of issuing a reactive statement, we filed a defamation notice supported by transcripts and evidence of intimidation. More importantly, we provided Amelia's firm with the audio of Daniel discussing narrative management. Their legal department listened carefully. Within days, their tone shifted. The internal review paused. Questions began turning toward Daniel's interference rather than Amelia's behavior. Influence works both ways once scrutiny enters the room. The true fracture came from an unexpected direction. A former project manager from one of Daniel's hotel developments contacted our attorney anonymously. She claimed she had been pressured to alter safety compliance reports before a major opening. At the time, she had remained silent, fearing retaliation. Seeing Amelia step forward had unsettled something in her. She provided documentation, emails, directives, financial shortcuts masked as strategic decisions. The information did not directly relate to the protective order, but it revealed a broader pattern: control, intimidation, narrative shaping. Daniel's authority relied on people believing resistance was futile. That belief was dissolving. I watched Amelia absorb the news with a mixture of vindication and grief. "So, it wasn't just me," she said quietly. "It was never just you," I replied. "Systems like his require multiple participants, some willing, some afraid." Daniel attempted one final maneuver. He requested a mediated meeting, claiming he wanted resolution without public conflict. Our attorney advised caution, but did not object. Mediation rooms are controlled environments. I understood them well. Amelia agreed on the condition that all communication be recorded and legal counsel present. When Daniel entered, he appeared composed but thinner, as if the strain of scrutiny had begun to erode him. He spoke about misunderstanding, about love distorted by stress. He framed his actions as protective rather than possessive. When confronted with the audio evidence, he shifted again, blaming Caroline for advising aggressive reputation management. It was the first time he distanced himself from his sister publicly. The fracture between them was subtle, but visible. Power alliances weaken when exposure threatens mutual survival. Amelia listened without interruption. That alone unsettled him. He was accustomed to her defending herself, apologizing, reacting. Now she simply waited. When he finished, she spoke in a voice so steady I barely recognized it as the same one that had once trembled in doubt. "You didn't misunderstand me," she said. "You diminished me." The mediator noted the statement carefully. Daniel attempted to argue nuance, but the transcript spoke louder than interpretation. The meeting ended without reconciliation. Instead, it strengthened our legal standing. His request for mediation, combined with evidence of coercion, reinforced the pattern of control under review by the court. Outside the legal arena, consequences accelerated. Investors began asking questions about governance within Daniel's family company. The business blog that had smeared Amelia published a cautious follow-up acknowledging emerging complexities. Caroline's public appearances decreased. The carefully curated image of flawless leadership developed visible cracks. None of it was explosive. There were no dramatic headlines. Just a steady erosion of certainty. Amelia returned to limited work under firm protection, her colleagues now aware of the manipulation attempted against her. Some apologized quietly for their earlier distance. Others admitted they had felt pressured by Daniel's influence. Fear, once named, loses some of its power. At home, the change in Amelia was profound but fragile. Freedom does not erase conditioning overnight. She still startled at unexpected phone notifications. She still hesitated before speaking decisively. But there was something new beneath the caution, anger tempered by clarity. One evening she stood in the kitchen, sunlight catching her hair, and said, "I kept trying to prove I was worthy of being treated well. I didn't realize worthiness was never the issue." That recognition was the true turning point. Abuse convinces you that love must be earned through compliance. Recovery begins when you understand love was never conditional in the first place. The court hearing for the protective order extension approached quickly. Daniel's legal team attempted to negotiate a quiet withdrawal in exchange for mutual non-disclosure. It was an offer designed to restore silence. Amelia considered it carefully. Public proceedings would invite scrutiny. Private settlement would end immediate stress. I told her the choice had to be hers. After a long pause, she shook her head. "If I disappear quietly, he learns nothing," she said. "And someone else will sit where I Saturday." In that moment, I saw the architect return, the woman who believed structures shape behavior. She chose the hearing. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, almost ordinary. Daniel avoided Amelia's gaze. Caroline was absent. When the recordings played, the room seemed to constrict around the sound of his own voice describing narrative control. The judge listened without visible reaction. Evidence was presented methodically, without drama. Dates, messages, witness statements, the garden incident, the laptop confrontation. When Amelia testified, she did not cry. She described events with factual precision, refusing both exaggeration and minimization. Daniel's attorney attempted to frame the situation as mutual conflict fueled by stress. But patterns do not lie. The extension was granted. The court recognized coercive behavior sufficient to warrant continued protection. As we walked down the courthouse steps, reporters were absent. There was no spectacle. Yet I felt something monumental shift. Daniel's power had relied on invisibility. Now it was documented. Caroline's influence had thrived on suggestion. Now it was countered by record. Amelia inhaled deeply, the autumn air sharp and clean. "It's strange," she said softly. "Nothing looks different, but everything feels different." She was right. The buildings around us stood unchanged. The city moved as it always had. But the narrative that once confined her had fractured beyond repair. And fractures, once formed, spread quietly until entire structures must be rebuilt. The months after the court extended the protective order were not triumphant. They were strategic. Daniel did not erupt publicly, and that restraint unsettled me more than open anger would have. Men like him rarely retreat without recalculating. His company released a brief statement about personal matters resolved through appropriate legal channels, carefully neutral, carefully dismissive. Caroline reappeared at industry events with immaculate composure, speaking about resilience and brand integrity as though the past year had been an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than exposure of coercion. The absence of overt retaliation did not signal surrender. It signaled repositioning. I warned Amelia that silence from opponents can mean preparation. She nodded, no longer naive enough to confuse quiet with safety. Yet I also saw exhaustion in her. Legal victories do not restore energy instantly. They simply remove immediate threat. Healing is slower, and public scrutiny lingers like humidity in southern air, invisible but heavy. Daniel's final attempt at leverage arrived through financial channels. During the engagement, several joint investments had been established under the pretense of shared future planning. Our attorney had already moved to disentangle most of them, but one development fund remained complicated. Daniel filed a motion alleging fiduciary misconduct, claiming Amelia had accessed proprietary information while still formally connected to his company. The accusation was thin, but the intent was clear: drag her back into litigation, reassert control through complexity. I studied the filing line by line. It was not strong enough to win outright, but strong enough to delay. Delay can be a weapon. The longer a case lingers, the more resources it consumes, the more doubt seeps into allies' confidence. Amelia read the motion once and closed her eyes. "He can't stand that I walked away," she said quietly. "So, he wants to keep me in reach." I told her something I had learned long ago. Control doesn't always need proximity. It only needs access. We would remove access completely. Our counter-strategy was not emotional, it was structural. We petitioned for an accelerated review supported by forensic audits of every joint account and communication thread related to the fund. Transparency would be our shield. Daniel's team likely assumed we would negotiate quietly to avoid extended exposure. Instead, we requested full disclosure. That decision forced them into an uncomfortable position. If they pursued the claim aggressively, their internal financial practices would face scrutiny under oath. If they withdrew, they would admit weakness. Caroline appeared at one preliminary hearing, her posture rigid, her expression carved from restraint. She avoided looking at Amelia entirely, as though acknowledgement might legitimize her independence. I studied her carefully. Caroline had always been the stabilizer of Daniel's narrative, the voice that reframed, softened, justified. Now she looked less certain. Systems strain when forced into open documentation. Secrets operate best in suggestion. Transcripts demand specificity. Meanwhile, Amelia's personal transformation deepened in quiet but unmistakable ways. She moved out of my house into a small apartment overlooking the river, insisting she needed space that belonged solely to her. The first evening I visited, sunlight poured across unfinished hardwood floors, illuminating walls she had painted a soft slate blue. There were no heavy drapes, no ornate furniture chosen for impression. Everything felt deliberate but light. She had resumed running in the mornings, not for fitness but for rhythm. "When I run," she told me, "my thoughts line up." She had begun volunteering with a nonprofit focused on urban renewal projects in underfunded neighborhoods. The work paid less than her previous firm but demanded authenticity rather than performance. I saw in her the gradual return of instinct, that internal compass Daniel had tried to recalibrate. Healing did not erase what had happened, but it reestablished authorship over her own narrative. The financial motion unraveled faster than Daniel anticipated. During sworn deposition, inconsistencies surfaced regarding asset transfers between his family's subsidiary companies. Nothing criminal in isolation, but enough to undermine the credibility of his claim against Amelia. Under questioning, he contradicted earlier statements about her level of involvement in strategic planning. Our attorney presented email threads demonstrating that decisions he now framed as unilateral were in fact directed solely by him. The room shifted perceptibly as the pattern reemerged, authority centralized, responsibility deflected. Caroline's composure cracked momentarily when pressed about her advisory role. She admitted recommending proactive reputation management strategies during personal conflicts. The phrase echoed uncomfortably in the transcript. By the end of the hearing, Daniel's motion appeared less like a legitimate grievance and more like retaliatory litigation. The judge dismissed it with restrained but pointed language about misuse of judicial resources. It was not dramatic, but it was definitive. Access had been severed. What surprised me most was not Daniel's reaction, but Amelia's. She did not celebrate. She did not speak about revenge or victory. Instead, she grew contemplative. One evening we sat on her balcony watching cargo ships move slowly along the water. "I used to think strength meant enduring," she said. "Now I think strength means refusing to participate in your own diminishment." Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity. That clarity signaled the final stage of disentanglement. Daniel could no longer manipulate her through guilt or nostalgia. She had reframed the entire experience, not as a failed engagement, but as a revelation about power. When people learn how control functions, they become far harder to recapture. Daniel attempted one last personal outreach despite the standing order. He sent a letter through an intermediary, not overtly romantic but reflective, describing his childhood, his pressure to meet family expectations, his confusion between love and dominance. It was carefully written, almost persuasive. He acknowledged mistakes without naming harm. He asked for understanding. Amelia handed the letter to me without reading past the first page. "He wants absolution," she said, "not accountability." We forwarded the communication to our attorney as a violation attempt. It resulted in a formal warning that further contact would trigger additional penalties. Daniel did not write again. Caroline, however, faced consequences of a different nature. Several board members within the family company initiated internal governance reviews following deposition transcripts that became accessible through business reporting channels. Investors do not tolerate reputational instability well. While no public scandal erupted, leadership adjustments were announced quietly. Caroline transitioned out of her role citing strategic realignment. Daniel stepped back from public-facing responsibilities. Official statements framed the shifts as organizational evolution, but anyone paying attention could trace the catalyst. Exposure does not always explode. Sometimes it erodes foundations slowly until restructuring becomes inevitable. Through it all, Amelia built something entirely separate from that world. She partnered with a small team of architects committed to community-centered design, launching a studio that prioritized collaboration over hierarchy. Her first independent project was modest, a neighborhood library renovation, yet she approached it with a passion I had not seen in years. At the opening ceremony, she stood before local families and spoke about spaces that make people feel visible. I watched from the back row, aware that visibility had once been weaponized against her. Now she reclaimed it deliberately. Afterward, a young intern approached her and asked how she had learned to assert herself in male-dominated rooms. Amelia paused before answering. "I learned the cost of staying silent," she said simply. For me, the transformation was equally instructive. I had spent decades navigating institutional crises, believing professionalism required emotional distance. But protecting my daughter demanded something more complex: restraint without passivity, anger without recklessness, strategy anchored in love rather than ego. I realized how easily even strong women can be conditioned to doubt their perception when manipulation is subtle and socially reinforced. Daniel had not relied solely on force. He relied on cultural narratives that excuse dominance as passion and obedience as harmony. Confronting him required dismantling those narratives piece by piece. It was exhausting. It was necessary. As winter settled over the river, Amelia invited me to dinner at her apartment. She cooked without anxiety, music playing softly in the background. There were no raised voices, no calculated glances, no invisible tension mapping the room. At one point she laughed, a full, unguarded sound that filled the space. I realized I had not heard that particular laugh since before her engagement. It struck me then that survival is not the same as living. For months, she had survived expertly. Now she was living again. The difference was unmistakable. The legal files were eventually closed. The protective order remained in place, but required no further enforcement. Daniel and Caroline retreated into restructured roles, their influence intact but diminished. The world did not collapse around them, nor did it need to. What mattered was simpler. They no longer had the power to redefine my daughter. Control thrives when victims internalize blame. Once that internal script is rewritten, the system loses its core leverage. Amelia had rewritten hers completely. One night before leaving her apartment, I asked whether she regretted anything. She considered the question carefully. "I regret how long I ignored myself," she said at last. "But I don't regret leaving." That answer carried more weight than any court ruling. Leaving had cost her reputation, temporary stability, and the illusion of certainty. But staying would have cost her identity. She chose identity. And identity, once reclaimed, becomes a shield stronger than silence ever was. 5 years have passed since the night I watched Daniel grip my daughter's arm beneath the polished surface of a celebratory dinner. Time has a way of smoothing sharp memories, but it has not erased the clarity of that moment for me. I still remember the exact shade of the garden lights, the controlled politeness in Caroline's smile, the fraction of a second when Amelia looked at me not for rescue, but for confirmation that she was not imagining what was happening. That look changed the trajectory of both our lives. Today, when I stand in Amelia's studio and watch her review blueprints with a team that treats her as an equal rather than an accessory, I see how far she has traveled internally. Freedom did not arrive as a dramatic liberation. It arrived in increments, in mornings where no one monitored her schedule, in meetings where her voice carried weight without punishment, in quiet evenings where silence was peaceful rather than oppressive. Survival had once required vigilance. Now stability feels unforced. Amelia's firm has grown slowly, but deliberately. They specialize in revitalizing neglected public spaces, libraries, community centers, parks overlooked by developers chasing larger profits. She tells me that neglected spaces remind her of how people can be overlooked when their value is not immediately profitable. The metaphor is not accidental. Healing reshapes perspective. She hires young architects who challenge her ideas, and she encourages debate rather than compliance. "If I ever start confusing authority with superiority," she told her team once, "call me out." That sentence would have been impossible for her years ago. Control once made her equate harmony with silence. Now she understands that disagreement can coexist with respect. Watching her mentor others, I recognize that breaking a cycle does more than free one person. It alters the environment for everyone who enters it afterward. Daniel's world did not collapse spectacularly. That is a truth many people misunderstand about justice. There was no headline scandal, no public disgrace broadcast across networks. Instead, his influence contracted quietly. Investors shifted trust. Boards restructured leadership. His public presence diminished. He still operates within his family's enterprise, but under scrutiny rather than unquestioned authority. I do not monitor his life obsessively. I only know what occasionally surfaces through business reports or mutual acquaintances. He remarried briefly. That union dissolved within a year. Patterns unaddressed tend to repeat. Caroline relocated to manage a smaller branch of the company abroad, framed as expansion but understood by insiders as containment. The empire remains standing, but the aura of invincibility is gone. Sometimes the most effective form of accountability is not destruction but limitation, the removal of unchecked access to harm. For me, the transformation was less visible but equally profound. I stepped back from high-profile litigation work and began consulting for organizations focused on workplace ethics and coercive dynamics. I speak to executive teams about the subtleties of control, how it begins with suggestion, how it flourishes in cultures that equate dominance with leadership, how silence can be misinterpreted as loyalty. I never mention Amelia by name. Her story is not a case study. It is her life. But the lessons inform everything I teach. I explain that coercion rarely announces itself through dramatic violence at first. It seeps in through language, through phrases like "for your own good" and "this is how things are done." I emphasize documentation, clarity, and the courage to question narratives that feel slightly off balance. Some listeners nod politely, uncomfortable. Others approach me afterward with stories they have never spoken aloud. I recognize that look in their eyes, the same one Amelia carried the night in the garden. Our relationship, my daughter's and mine, has also evolved. There was a time when I feared my intervention might permanently alter how she saw me, that she would view my strategy as intrusion rather than support. Instead, what grew between us is deeper trust. She knows I will not act for her without her consent. I know she will not minimize her instincts to spare my feelings. We speak more honestly now, even about uncomfortable truths. One evening over dinner, she admitted that part of her resented me briefly during the legal battle because my composure made everything feel clinical. "I needed you to be angry sometimes," she said gently. I listened without defensiveness. She was right. In my effort to remain strategic, I occasionally suppressed visible emotion. Since then, I have learned that strength does not require emotional absence. Anger, when expressed responsibly, can validate pain. That lesson changed me as much as any courtroom victory. Amelia is seeing someone now, not a dramatic romance, but a steady partnership. His name is Marcus, a civil engineer she met during a community redevelopment project. The first time I observed them together, I watched for the familiar signs: interruption, possessive body language, subtle correction. I saw none. When they disagree, they lean toward each other rather than away. Once, during a tense conversation about a delayed permit, Marcus raised his voice slightly out of frustration. He stopped mid-sentence, inhaled, and said, "I'm sorry, that wasn't fair."
No prompting. No defensiveness.
The apology was not a strategy, it was awareness. Afterward, Amelia told me the moment unsettled her at first, not because he frightened her, but because she realized how conditioned she had been to expect escalation rather than reflection. Healing reveals how abnormal dysfunction truly was. Sometimes I revisit the files from those early months, the emails, the transcripts, the timelines. Not out of obsession, but as reminder. It would be easy to rewrite the story in my mind as inevitable, as though we were always destined to prevail. That would be dishonest. There were nights I lay awake questioning whether I had pushed too hard, whether legal exposure would harm Amelia more than silence. There were moments when she almost returned, exhausted by conflict. Courage is rarely constant. It flickers. What sustained us was not certainty but documentation and shared resolve. Evidence anchored us when doubt threatened to distort memory. I encourage every woman who confides in me now to record facts without embellishment. Not because every situation requires litigation, but because clarity protects against gaslighting. When someone attempts to rewrite your reality, written truth becomes a compass. If I distill everything these years have taught me, 5 lessons stand above the rest. First, control often disguises itself as devotion. Excessive guidance, isolation framed as protection, criticism wrapped in concern. These are early signals, not romantic intensity. Second, resilience does not mean endurance of harm. It means recognition of it. Amelia believed tolerating discomfort proved maturity. In reality, boundaries prove self-respect. Third, influence can delay justice, but rarely survives sustained transparency. Once patterns are documented and exposed consistently, even powerful networks fracture. Fourth, leaving may destabilize every area of your life temporarily: career, friendships, finances, but staying inside coercion erodes identity in ways far harder to rebuild. And fifth, healing is not linear. It revisits old wounds unexpectedly, but each revisit carries less power than before. On quiet evenings, I sometimes sit on Amelia's balcony again and watch the river traffic move steadily under the fading light. The city hums with ordinary life, conversations drifting upward, distant music, the clink of dishes from neighboring apartments. Ordinary sounds once masked extraordinary tension. Now they feel simply ordinary. Amelia stands beside me, her posture relaxed, no longer scanning for invisible threats. I think about the night I chose not to react impulsively at that dinner table years ago. Restraint then was not weakness, it was preparation. Had I exploded in that moment, Daniel and Caroline would have framed me as hysterical, and Amelia might have retreated further into doubt. Strategy gave us time. Time gave us evidence. Evidence gave us freedom. I do not romanticize what happened. It cost us both. Trust once fractured is rebuilt slowly, even with oneself. Amelia still hesitates occasionally before asserting a need, as though checking for unseen consequences. But she corrects herself faster now. She catches the reflex and replaces it with intention. That self-awareness is the true victory. Daniel no longer defines her reactions. Caroline no longer narrates her identity. The system that attempted to confine her underestimated the durability of truth when handled patiently. If someone listening to this story recognizes fragments of their own life within it, I offer this. Doubt your fear less than you doubt your worth. If your world has begun to shrink around someone else's comfort, pause. Expansion should not require disappearance. Ask yourself whether love feels like permission or performance. And if the answer unsettles you, begin documenting, begin speaking, begin preparing, even if you are not ready to leave yet. Strategy is not betrayal, it is self-preservation. When I look at my daughter now, I no longer see the woman who lowered her eyes at a dinner table. I see the architect she was always meant to be, designing spaces where others can breathe. And I understand something with the same clarity that once terrified me. Silence can protect harm, but it can also protect strategy. The difference lies in intention.
Oui, chose intention.
And that choice rearranged everything that followed.